Alright guys, welcome back. We're going to talk about a drug. When I first started in EMS, this was kind of like a cardiac staple drug. It was like epinephrine as we use it today. Again, we've learned a lot of things, and we learned that it's not necessarily a great drug, but I think that it has its uses, and again, it has its ability. And I'm talking about sodium bicarb. And you need to know your ions when you're given sodium bicarb. I can't stress that one enough. And it's really important to understand how this drug breaks down in your body, because that is a really important factor, and it's some of the reasons you got to know when you're giving this drug what it does, okay? So it's a salt that provides a bicarbonate buffer. So again, our bicarbonate is what helps regulate our pH. So what we're doing is we're using this to correct problems in the pH. Now, the number one way that in EMS we usually do this is with the respiratory system. We ventilate them well, and it usually causes any respiratory acidosis to go away. But there are other acidosi. Metabolic acidosis is the big one. And we use bicarb to correct metabolic acidotic states. Now, here's our problem. We don't have blood gases in the field. Most people don't. Okay, there are some services that do. If you're on a critical care truck, obviously you can use a blood gas machine there. If you're doing a transfer, I highly recommend that you know what that patient's pH is before you're leaving. You need to know what that level is. Okay, it needs to be between 7.35 to 7.45, and I would make darn sure that that was at least close to being corrected before starting to transport the patient. So again, it's an alkalotic agent. It's used as an antacid, actually. And again, it's an electrolyte, and again, it's a buffer solution. That's what we made for it. So again, more bicarb. Yeah, it amazes me that, again, like I said, when I first started in this business, bicarb was kind of a big drug. When you got to the patient, 2 amps of bicarb, 2 amps of calcium. And that changed shortly after I became a paramedic to, well, we found out that that's not necessarily good for everybody. And for certain arrests, I 1000% agree. There's some times when we shouldn't be using that. But in other type of arrests where we think that there's an acidosis problem, then yes, it is actually a very good drug to use, okay? So again, it buffers the hydrogen ions. It elevates our pH levels in our blood. That's what it's used to do, okay? And again, acidosis decreases our contractility of our heart. It doesn't let it squeeze. And it also, acidosis causes the catecholamines to not work as well. So the idea is if you correct that, then the epi works better, everything else works better, and they're more likely to respond to a defibrillation. The problem with that is that if you go the other direction, it's also bad as well. And we were doing that kind of blind where we didn't have the levels for that. So again, in a non-perfusing patient, sodium bicarb is shown to increase the intracellular acidosis and thus worsening the acid-base balance. And again, so when we give this drug, that's kind of where I have to say we have to have good perfusion, even if it's us providing it. Good CPR is an absolute must when you're given sodium bicarb. Good ventilations is an absolute must when giving sodium bicarb. Now, we usually start this out, it usually takes about 2 to 10 minutes to work, and 30 to 60 minutes later, it usually is out of the system. And I can tell you that if you got a severe acidotic state, you might actually, tricyclic antidepressant overdoses is a good example, where they continue to make the acid. They might actually have to put them onto a drip in order to help maintain your pH balance. Let's mix some of that sodium bicarb up, heat it in a spoon, we'll make some crack. Yeah, no, afraid not. It doesn't exactly work like that. So, a couple of things that we do use it for. Aspirin overdoses we use it for. Barbiturate overdoses we use it for. Tricyclic antidepressant overdoses. All of these drugs, if you really look at it, cause an acidotic state. That's why we give it, okay? I will tell you right now, National Registry loves to give you guys a tricyclic antidepressant overdose. The cure is sodium bicarbonate. Okay, enough said. Again, if you're not sure, you need to make sure you know what your protocols are. Usually, and again, even if you have to call for orders to get that, feel free to do so, okay? Severe acidosis, refractory to hyperventilation, all right? So the number one way that we try to buffer somebody is to bag them and ventilate them well, all right? Ventilate them well. If they're still acidotic, then we give them the sodium bicarb to counteract the metabolic acidosis, okay? And again, acidosis due to cardiac arrest, okay? So again, make sure, or any type of metabolic dysfunction. Your diabetic ketoacidosis, by the way, bicarb is kind of a big one there because it corrects the metabolic acidosis, and it also adds water to the system, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. Actually, we'll talk about it now. So when bicarb, you got to understand. As a matter of fact, I usually use the code. Sorry guys, it's not working for me. Pen, there we go. So the chemical symbol, by the way, for bicarbonate is NaHCO3. Okay. The Na, by the way, is a cation. The HCO3 is an anion. Okay, but together that's the chemical makeup of sodium bicarbonate. So what happens is when we inject this into our body, by the way, so it releases the sodium, and that usually joins up with chloride internally in our system. Okay, so just as a reminder, it's probably going to drop your chlorine levels when you give it. The bicarbonate actually breaks down into, let's see here, we got, it actually breaks down into this. Now, I will tell you, those of you that are science majors, you go, wait a minute, those numbers don't match up. But usually it does is it releases one of them. So carbon dioxide is one of the side effects of it. And then it usually combines with the free hydrogen. Remember that our pH level is free hydrogen in our bloodstream. So that combines with that to make water and CO2. Oh, wait a minute. So if you're making a bunch of CO2, what is it you got to be able to do? Get rid of said CO2. Again, good ventilation is absolutely imperative, okay? Absolutely imperative, all right? Now, back to our contraindications here, after we get that little explanation. Let's see here, laser point. I don't want a laser pointer, just want a regular thing. Let's just do escape. There we go, all right. How about I erase everything on the slide? All right, so now that we did that, let's talk about when we do, and more importantly, when you don't use it, all right? So when you don't use it, if you got CHF, if you got metabolic acidosis, don't use it, okay? Metabolic alkalosis. You want to use it in metabolic acidosis. Don't use it in metabolic alkalosis, all right? Loss of chlorine due to emesis. Hey, we talked about why that is, because again, it's going to absorb chlorine ions, all right? Continuous suctioning when the patient receiving diuretics, okay? We usually don't want to do that, okay? There's a problem there. If they're in respiratory alkalosis, if they're in hypocalcemia, okay? Hypercalcemia, it's a great drug. Hypo, really bad drug. Hyperkalemia, great drug. Low potassium, bad drug, okay? Really bad drug. So make sure that you don't have any hypocalcemia or any hypokalemia, all right? Now, if you put this fluid outside of a vein, you're going to cause tissue death, okay? It's got to be in a very patent vein. I usually run enough cc's where I'm positive that it's in a vein and nothing else, okay? If you are giving a matter of fact, sodium bicarb, for that matter, doesn't play nice with pretty much everybody. So I would probably have its own line if I'm giving it that way. I would even start another line if I had to give a drip of it. I would definitely start a second, third, fourth line. You don't want to push epi and sodium bicarb in the same vial, in the same tubing. It's going to form a precipitate, and it's not going to be useful. By the way, if you push it through your dopamine line, well, you have just ruined everything. you're going to get precipitate in there. So any of your catecholamines, stay away from it. By the way, calcium does the same thing. And then again, alkalines of urine may increase the half-life of certain drugs. So understand that when you throw the body out of the you're trying to put it back into balance, even though they're acidotic, certain drugs that can make the half-life shorter on. Okay. Now, I think I've hammered this point home, but I'm going to hammer it really hard now. Got to have good ventilations. You got to have good oxygenation. And I'm going to add the third one there. The blood needs to be going round and round. Okay, the better that is, the better this is going to work. Okay, and again, make sure that this patient has good ventilation. I just explained why. Chemically, it breaks down into carbon dioxide and water. By the way, they should probably have pretty decent kidney function as well, because they're going to need to get rid of that fluid. If not, they need to be on dialysis to start getting rid of that fluid. All right. You can result in sodium overload, by the way, so you really need to make sure if they're giving sodium bicarb, you want to know what their last sodium level was. All right. And again, well, Scott, I don't have sodium on my truck. You're right, you don't. On a normal thing, again, where we're dealing with a transported patient. All right. Now, it can exacerbate CHF. Why? You're giving them more fluid in their system, right? And bicarb administration, it produces carbon dioxide. Again, I can't stress that enough. If you don't get rid of the carbon dioxide that it's now making, the patient's going to go more acidotic inside the cell. They're going to get worse. You're hurting the situation. And this was the big problem when we were giving it back early 1990s, okay? 1980s and 90s is we weren't doing good CPR, and we weren't really ventilating the patient that well. And therefore, this didn't work, and we made them worse by giving bicarb, okay? So we actually did make them worse by giving those massive amounts. All right, so our dosing, really simple. Peds or adult, it's 1 milliequivalent per kilogram, okay? Of an 8.4 solution for adult, we cut it in half for the infants. They usually use a 4.2. And again, if you don't have 4.2 with the really tiny ones, again, mix it 1 to 1. All right, you're not going to be given that much. Usually, I take a flush, I push out 5 cc's, I pull up 5 cc's. I've got 5 milliequivalents. If I'm giving it to a baby, very rarely am I going to give more than 2 of those. Okay. And again, I would go with a very cautious, and only if the doc said for me to do it. I will tell you that most places, you pretty much, unless they're in cardiac arrest with a prolonged downtime, if you call the doc, you're going to need to get orders, even for, let's say, a tricyclic antidepressant overdose or an aspirin overdose. You're going to need to have orders in order to give this. All right? Again, IV and IO and a patent one, we want to make sure that it's good and open. So man who adds too much sodium bicarb have basic problem. A little bit of a science joke there. All right, so that's it. And again, I know that was kind of a little bit long, but if you understand how sodium bicarb works, you got a much better idea of when to and when not to use it. All right, guys, I'm going to talk to you on the next one. See ya.